A sign in English and Chinese in Shanghai read very simply, "If you are stolen, call the police at once." Very good advice, especially for people who are stolen. Today's guest is Matt Rocco. Matt is the VP of Sales and a scaling strategist at Mojo Global. Mojo Global, which unites people for events and masterminds and has a unique technology that uses LinkedIn for business growth and expansion. In its 14th year, Mojo has over 7,000 clients in 30 countries with a 30% revenue growth trajectory, largely attributed to Matt. He has worked with sales guru Grant Cardone, the companies of entrepreneur Mark Cuban, Chicken Soup for the Soul author Mark Victor Hansen, and financial literacy advocate Sharon Lecter. It helps if I'm illiterate myself, I think. Matt's focus has always been to provide outstanding value to anyone he talks to or works with. Welcome, Matt. Delighted that you're with us today.
Thank you so much, Philip. Glad to be here.
Perhaps you could start by telling us a bit about your background and how you got into Mojo, and then how you developed your international expertise.
Okay, absolutely. Well, my background for really all of my professional career has been tied directly to sales and marketing efforts for multiple businesses. I've owned a couple of businesses and then worked for many companies. A couple of those have had international outreach that they do. One of them was a manufacturing company, and a majority of their book of business was all overseas. The company Mojo Global, we have clients in over 30 countries, and a majority of what we do, a good portion of it is international. So my background was primarily sales and marketing, and I've always been very intrigued with the way the world has moved in a direction that some of the old traditional marketing efforts have changed, in that you can add some technology to the traditional methods. And by traditional methods, I mean the outreach, the nurturing, the continued follow-up that's needed. You can automate some of those processes, you can systemize them, and you can all of a sudden reach a bigger audience a lot quicker than you ever were able to. And I'm a big proponent of companies that want to scale, going ahead and implementing some of those strategies and getting a quicker trajectory towards income and revenue.
That's great. Did you study international business in some way, or did you learn it on the fly?
No, my studies were all just based on business management. And so it is something that I've just learned on the fly through experience. And
have you personally traveled abroad a lot?
Not a ton, but I have been to a couple of different countries, and but primarily traveled within the US.
Excellent.
Yeah.
From what I've read of your background, you've had some very interesting corporate experiences with Mojo in different parts of the world. Let's start with our northern neighbor, Canada. What can you tell us about how you've had to adjust your technology to market to the Canadians?
The one thing that I've found right away when you're working with the Canadian market is that there's a little bit of a perceived expectation on their side that their marketplace is completely different than the US. And so as a US-based company that's meeting with Canadians who are looking to grow and scale their businesses, you do have to overcome what they have as a perceived, they say right off the bat, Canada's so much different than the US. And while there's some truth to that, when we really boil down to it and we start just going into the raw numbers of the amount of businesses that are available to market to, the potential revenues, we find that the markets are actually fairly similar. And so you do find that mindset is oftentimes one of the biggest hurdles you have to overcome when working with people from different countries.
Yes, that's very true. Can you give us examples of other countries where the mindset has been an obstacle or where it's been a benefit to working with your technology?
Yeah, absolutely. Let's break it down. One of the things I'll point out is the U.S. in and of itself as a country is more technologically advanced than about every other country. Japan is their technology is actually ahead of where the U.S. is, but that would be one of the only countries that we've seen where the technology is ahead. The U.S. in many cases is further along than any other country, and so you're dealing with countries where our technology from maybe the 2000s is actually new to many of the other third world countries. And so you're bringing them, taking them away from a traditional marketing, where a lot of their time is spent face to face with clients. They're not going out there and using the LinkedIn and the internet to actually market. And so you're introducing it to them, and it's something where you have to have them buy into the fact that this is a new way of life. So it'd be like, imagine, 15 years ago, if you were told that there would be a Facebook and that you would be connected to this entire world, and that, you'd have a little bit of disbelief. Well, we find when we are introducing our technology to many people in different countries, they're like, they kind of look at you and they say, that works? That's interesting. I've never even heard of that. So it's sometimes just they're not aware, lack of awareness.
If they are aware, well, first of all, I'd like to explore what you said about we're ahead in technology, because many cases the Europeans or certain countries like Germany or Britain feel that they're ahead of the US in some ways. For example, I know Korea is, South Korea, of course, is ahead of us in terms of, it's not mobile banking. That's certainly a technology used more commonly in Africa. But the idea that you can pay for anything by swiping your phone at the cash register at a checkout counter. And the amount is automatically debited or credited to your account and so forth. So there are more cashless societies than we are. So in a way, that technology is ahead of us. But what you're referring to is more LinkedIn and marketing technologies. Is that correct?
Correct. Yeah, I would say a lot of the marketing has stayed more traditional in the other countries from what we've experienced. And so because they're relying on those traditional methods more heavily, when you introduce something where you're adding an automation tool to the outreach, or you're adding, a new method to get the right people to raise their hand and pursue them, instead of them having to, the traditional method is that you pursue your potential clients and you work to have them see you, who you are, and set a time with you. The newer methods are that you, as a branded expert, get your information out in front of them, and they actually raise their hand and pursue you,
right?
Which is a lot of the traditional methods. So that's probably the biggest difference that we see, is that, from an enterprise standpoint and just from a free commerce standpoint here in the United States, it's done a lot differently.
Do you find that it's much easier in Europe, Western Europe, well, Eastern Europe as well, to introduce the technology? Is it something they're more accustomed to, or is it are they still behind us in some way?
Places like Europe are still a little more old-fashioned than what the US is right now.
Okay. And I presume that's because business is traditionally done with relationships, with who you know, and introductions primarily.
Yeah, I would say that that's a big part of it. I really would.
When you introduce your LinkedIn technology to the Europeans, is there a resistance, or is it just something they're adding to their current methods?
I would say that there is some resistance in comparison to America. America right now is so open to the ways that you can market, and people, it allows for just that freedom of commerce. And in European countries and some of the others that we've worked through, they're just not as open to it. So it just there's definitely a longer sales cycle, because those introductions, there has to be a buy-in, there has to be a belief, and then they are more open to looking at it.
Back to Canada for a moment. Have you found any differences between English and French Canada?
No, not specifically. And my interactions specifically have been more with the English side and not so much the French.
Okay. Do you do any marketing in other languages, such as French, for example, for Canada?
So we work with our clients. They do all the translation. And so they are the ones who are producing the content in a different language, but we give them the foundational, scripts and some of that stuff that they can use. But they do, a couple of them have a complete site that's built entirely in like a French language or something different.
Right. When you deal with, let me back up for a moment. When you're dealing in these other languages, well, let me change that. Let me go back 2 steps. Perhaps you could explain your technology in terms of, I think most people are familiar with what LinkedIn is, but what are you doing with LinkedIn that's different than normal LinkedIn marketing?
Great question. So LinkedIn in and of itself is the most amazing business professional tool to find a very targeted list of individuals. And so there's not another platform out there today that'll let you connect with a very specific audience. And once that's been determined that you can find that group of people, many find it challenging to engage that prospect list and actually, work with them to get them to a calendar, to actually set up a meeting. And you see all sorts of approaches on LinkedIn. We've all been inundated with, people trying to meet you for the first time and sell you on something instantly. And it's not a way that most people are welcome to, receiving that information. So we walk people through a much different process to where they are there to deliver value first, and then they move it towards a sale at the point where it's determined that someone is even a fit for their business. But we're taking the search technology of LinkedIn, we're combining it with some automation. So some of the initial outreaches can be done through an automation tool that we wrote in-house. And the second piece of it that's really probably the most crucial is that we're implementing follow-up campaigns for individuals who otherwise would be touching someone one time, and that's the last time that person hears from them.
Right. So you have the follow-up software as well, or follow-up piece as well.
Extremely important. Yes, yeah. That's there.
Definitely. What is the most challenging country that you've tried to enter so far, do you think?
From my experience, it's been Dubai. And it is an area where when you're connecting with business professionals who are marketing either exclusively to Dubai, or they'll market both to the US and to Dubai, they are of the mindset that Dubai is its own little world and that their methods there are done in a completely different way. And so we've got some great success stories of people who, have a technology that they're releasing and introducing to every realtor within that country, and have had great success with it, when from the get-go the initial expectation was that this will never work. And so I think Dubai is an interesting country in that they have amazing professionals over there who are very successful, and because of that perceived level of success, the expectation might be that you wouldn't be able to approach these folks in the same way that you could someone making $60,000 a year, $80,000 a year. But at the end of the day, it goes back to just the foundational traditional processes that you have to make an introduction, you have to nurture, you nurture, you nurture, you build trust, you build trust, you build trust. And at the end of the day, whether you're in Dubai or you're, in the US, it's the same method.
Yeah. But what makes Dubai so difficult in a way? Because especially in the Muslim world, relationships are very key. They're extremely important. So if LinkedIn is doing this at least to get let's say, get the introduction, then I presume a person would want to follow up with a personal meeting or a Zoom connection or something like that to pursue the relationship.
Yeah. Yeah, you definitely, that's step one, is just the introduction. And then the next step is to continue to move it forward. You do find that the engagement and the participation within something like LinkedIn is not as aggressive in an area like Dubai. And they do use, there's other technologies that are very similar to LinkedIn that are used in other areas. So maybe that's a portion of what that is.
Have you tried to penetrate Latin America?
Not specifically. We have not.
Yeah, I'm asking because Latin America is another region where relationships are extremely important. Personal relationships are extremely important. And so I was just wondering how your technology would work there.
Yeah. I can't speak to that specifically, but definitely a good question.
What about Asia, East Asia?
We don't do a lot right now in Asia or East Asia. It's just not a market right now for us that we're targeting. It may be in time. That's areas that we look to grow in.
Okay. That's also a region where personal relationships are very critical. So I was wondering again if your technology.
Yeah, I like that observation, Philip, because those areas would lend themselves traditionally to something where people do appreciate that process of more of the relationship building, nurturing, doing all of that.
Yeah. So in which parts of the world have you been most successful? Is it mainly in Europe?
It would be a combination. You've got US, Canada, and Europe, and some of the Dutch regions. We do some stuff there as well.
Such as the Dutch Caribbean? What do you mean the Dutch region?
Yeah, Dutch Caribbean.
Okay, interesting. What about in the French and English Caribbean? Any activity there?
Not anything real specific. And so I think some of that could be just based on, I don't know if the quantity of transactions and some of that stuff is going on. Some of those areas are more, possibly more difficult to penetrate is really what I think is probably the case there.
When people are receptive to your technology, are there certain qualities that you find in these people that are different from people who are just not receptive?
That's a really great question. Yeah, I would say that there's, I'll give a couple of examples. So you have the individuals who will understand what you do. They will see the advantages of, let's take it back a step further. So when the first Ford automobile was built, there were a certain amount of time that it took Henry Ford to build it. And then over time, he added automation, he added systems, and he added processes. And they have it now to where they produce, a vehicle every couple of minutes, basically.
Mm-hmm.
So when you walk someone through a steps and you say, there is outreach that you can do on a monthly basis that would far surpass the amount of hours you could put in a day. And you could really attract a great audience using this. They will take a step back and they'll say, that's great, but I don't see how it would work for my market. And if someone is of the belief in their own mind that their market is different than the rest of the world and that their audience is different than the rest of the world, then it can be very challenging to get that person to move forward with something that would save them a lot of time. So, step one is their mindset something that they are willing to change or willing to at least be, look at other options, or are they pretty set in their ways? And so the ones that move quickest and move furthest are the ones who are willing to acknowledge the fact that, we're living in a day and age where you can put the information out there in front of people, they can pursue you. And most of those people move at a much quicker pace towards success.
Right. Have you tapped into certain I'll call them oases of technology. For example, in Africa, there are certain places like Lagos and Nairobi that are more technology savvy than other parts of the continent, and that are grooming a lot of people in the IT field, for example. Have you ever targeted or thought of targeting those kinds of markets?
Not specifically up to this point. So that would be something that would be, I love your thought process on that, because if you're going to target a certain market, you definitely should pick the areas that would lend itself quickest to, what you're doing. So that's good.
Okay. When you promote your product in other countries, do you change it in some way to make it appeal to the benefits or to the mindset of the local population?
The answer to that is that yes, definitely. I take something like an area like Dubai. I do feel like when you're working with someone there, they have such a bigger picture mindset, and there's less limits. The possibilities are endless. And when someone comes to the table with that mindset, you can present bigger picture projects, and they'll buy in much quicker. There's areas in different countries that have either had, global economic, downturns and stuff like that, which lately that's been, many areas, but some of those hardest hit regions, and it's probably happened over the last 12 to 24 months, a lot of those folks come to the table with a mindset that things are pretty bad, things are pretty bleak. Why would this work for me? How can you convince me that this is going to change my life? And in comparison to something like Dubai, where they're thriving, they come to the table more looking at, all right, I can take over and conquer the world. How do I do this?
That's very clever. You said that Dubai looks at the big picture, but you've also said that it's the most challenging market or most difficult market. So those two statements to me seem contradictory.
Well, just because someone has that big picture mindset doesn't mean that they're going to accept a traditional method of needing to nurture and a slower approach to get in front of an audience.
Oh.
So to me, they're one of the hardest areas to sell in, because they are convinced that they have a bigger picture way to do it, and they don't have to go a slow route, a traditional method of nurturing. And I even talked to one of our founders, Corey. He spends a great deal of time traveling internationally. And the one thing that he said is always comes back and is true to form is that the traditional method of marketing is always the way it's going to be. And I can give you an example of that if we have the time.
Yes, please.
So I know that he recently traveled to Istanbul, Turkey, and was walking up to a stand. He went to one of the oldest marketplaces that are there in that region. And he kind of had this moment where he was, picturing this whole scenario. He walked up to a stand, and the gentleman that was behind the stand walked up and asked him if he wanted anything or needed help with anything. And he said, he hadn't had a whole lot of time to look at much. And so he kind of was like, no, thanks, and moved on to the next stand. And he started thinking about LinkedIn and the fact, with what we do. And he said, if that gentleman wouldn't have stepped up and asked him if he needed help, the argument could be made that the guy didn't care about his business, so why would you buy from him anyways? But then the fact that he walked up to him and immediately tried to say, is there something you're wanting to buy, kind of made him walk away. So he said, within the LinkedIn market, you have to do something. You have to let people know who you are. You have to put your information out there in front of them. But the approach has to be so careful in that you do not come salesy. You do not have any type of a pitch. You're simply there to say, if I can provide value, I'm here. And that's probably the greatest thing, is that at the end of the day, the traditional way of just walking up to someone and saying, hey, if I can be of help, let me know. And then you kind of you back off. And it's such a careful, delicate dance.
So does your software adjust for that in Turkey, for example?
It would. It absolutely would. And it's all in the messaging, and the approach is important.
Can you give me examples of other kinds of messaging where you might change it? The US would be one way and another country would be another way with the messaging.
So, and I see now what you were asking a minute ago with the question. So the messaging actually does carry through pretty much the same country to country. We don't find that at the end of the day, that's the human to human interaction, and there's not a drastic change. There's some maybe different wording that's used. Mm-hmm. So the dialect was adjusted a little bit, but the actual foundational message is the same.
That's interesting. Many cultures, such as Latin America, for example, and I know you don't focus a lot there, but Latin America focuses a lot on the family. So if you find a culture that is, say, family-oriented or environment-oriented, as Germany is, would you see if you can tailor your messages toward that appeal, that cultural appeal, or would you stick to the American, the basic recipe that you've developed for the United States?
I guess the greatest thing to look at is that you can use technology to produce results about how your messaging is working. So the answer is that you would start out using the messaging that we've already created, and it would be based on, just kind of a generic. It wouldn't be tied to family or anything specific to their region. Mm-hmm. But if you saw that the engagement wasn't working and you weren't getting the acceptance rates, you weren't getting the response rates that we're accustomed to seeing, you would need to tailor that message. And so I guess it's not out of the realm of reason that it could be tailored, but you'd have to just test it and see.
And do you leave that to each country or each client, or do you somehow manage that process from your headquarters?
So as a company, we have two offers. One is that we'll work with you as a coach very closely to launch your campaigns. And so for that, we'd be advising the client on what to look for, how it needs to be adjusted. And so we'll typically work with someone for at least a month and a half really closely while they're going through that process. But we also do a concierge done for you service where someone says, I just want to wake up on Monday morning and see that I have 3 meetings each day. And they let us handle all the back end, all the outreach, all the calls, all the communication. And for that, our team would be the one adjusting that messaging for those clients.
So that your team is flexible to understand that there are different ways of approaching different kinds of clients.
Very much so. Yeah, when we're in our 14th year, so we've experienced all of that. And both of our founders, Corey and Ira, are very sensitive to the fact that sometimes different messaging is needed.
And where is your company based?
Scottsdale, Arizona is where it is. And
yes,
it for the inception of the company all the way through probably 7-8 years ago, most of the team was right there in person working together out of a big office. And the last 7-8 years, it's been more of a remote team.
For the last how many years?
7 to 8 years.
7 to 8.
So pre-COVID.
Pre-COVID. Excellent.
It was.
I went to graduate school in Phoenix, so I know Scottsdale well.
Fairly close region. Yeah.
Has there been any country outside of the United States that's been most successful for you?
No, I mean, there's been, maybe a close second, but the US has without a doubt been our most successful area that we work with.
What is the close second? Is that Canada?
It'd be Canada.
Canada.
It'd be Canada.
And the rest of, I guess, 3rd, 4th, and 5th are primarily in Europe?
It would be, it'd be tough to find one that takes the lead on that. But yeah, all through Europe.
Good. Do you price your products differently for different countries or regions?
We do not. So there are areas where, unfortunately, their actual cost at the end of the day is higher than what it would be if they were based in the US.
I'm sorry, say that again. The cost would be higher than in the US.
They're based on what the conversion rates are on their dollars versus the US dollar. There are times when they're paying more for our service.
Okay, so the currency exchange issue. So it's not about pricing per se, it's the currency exchange.
Correct.
Okay, so your prices are the same worldwide. It's just the currency would determine, okay, the profitability, the costs, and the rest of it.
The ROI at the end of the day on what they've invested in. Yeah.
And are your developers all in the US or are they in other countries as well?
We do have some folks that are based out of the Philippines and also India.
I was just thinking India because it's another very high-tech country. Do you sell into India?
We do. We definitely do.
And do you change your methods there in any way? Because they're
not specifically that I'm aware of. We actually do have a member of our sales team who is based out of India. And so he ends up working with those clients directly. And not a conversation we've ever had, but good question.
So he's based in India or he's based in Arizona?
Nope, he's based in India.
Based in India. Okay.
Yeah.
That would make the most sense, of course.
Yeah.
Very good. Is there anything else you'd like to add before we conclude?
Not specifically. I think there is a overall acknowledgement that any business professional needs to make in this day and time, and it's that the digital world, and you lump LinkedIn into that. The digital world right now is wide open for you to capture business and get the attention of your prospect audience, unlike there's ever been. And so if you have always done it kind of the traditional old school methods, just consider the fact that there is a whole nother world out there that you could look into and do some research on. And you may find that it's a way to do business working smarter, not harder.
Very wise. That's great advice. Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Absolutely. Enjoyed it. Thank you, Philip.
Thank you.